The Apache neighbor was bitten on the thigh. She begged the rancher, "Suck the poison, hurry." The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the vast, dusty plains of the desert. The dry wind whispered across the land, rustling the sparse shrubs and kicking up small clouds of sand. Clay, the rancher, stood by his barn, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He had spent another long day tending to the cattle and making sure everything on the ranch was in order. Life out here was hard, but it had its rhythm. The routine of the ranch kept him busy, and in his solitude, Clay had grown accustomed to the peaceful quiet of the desert. Clay's ranch sat at the edge of a small Apache settlement. The two worlds were vastly different but somehow intertwined. For years, he had been neighbors with Maria, an Apache woman who lived in the settlement with her family. Maria was a strong and independent woman. She wasn't like the others in her village. She was known for her knowledge of the desert, its plants, and its animals. She could track an animal for miles, find water where others saw none, and heal wounds with herbs and potions. Many of the ranchers in the area had learned to respect her wisdom. Maria and Clay had known each other for a long time, but their relationship had always been one of respect from a distance. They exchanged friendly nods when they met on the rare occasions they crossed paths. Their conversations were always brief but meaningful. She would tell him about the latest rains or the movement of certain animals, and he would share news about the cattle or the weather. But tonight was different. As Clay walked back to the porch of his small, weathered house, he saw a figure in the distance. A rider on horseback was making their way across the dusty road toward his ranch. He squinted, trying to make out who it was. The rider was alone, moving with purpose. When the rider got closer, Clay's heart skipped a beat. It was Maria. She rode a dark horse, her long hair tied back in a braid that swayed with every movement of the animal. Her face was set in a determined expression, but there was something in her posture, something in the way she sat on the horse, that told Clay she was in trouble. The way she held her reins loosely and leaned forward on the horse's neck made it clear that something was wrong. Clay stepped off the porch, his boots making a soft thud on the wooden steps. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his shoulder. He had never known Maria to ride this way. She was always careful, always composed. As she drew closer, he could see the pain in her eyes. It wasn't just physical. There was something deeper there, something that set off a warning bell in his chest. "Maria," Clay called out, his voice rough from the dry air. "What's wrong?" Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she urged her horse to move faster, closing the distance between them quickly. When she was close enough, she pulled the reins sharply, bringing the horse to a stop. She slid off the saddle and stood before Clay, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Clay, I need your help," she said, her voice strained with effort. "I've been bitten." At first, Clay didn't understand what she meant. "Bitten?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Bitten by what?" Maria's hand reached down to her thigh just above her knee. When she pulled it away, Clay saw the blood dark and spreading, soaked into her leggings. Her skin was already starting to swell, and there were dark lines around the bite mark that looked like they were moving. A cold shiver ran down Clay's spine. The shape of the wound was unmistakable. "A rattlesnake," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was gathering herbs when I stepped too close." Clay's heart dropped. He knew how dangerous rattlesnake bites could be, especially out here in the desert where help was far away. Time was of the essence. "I need you to suck the poison out, Clay," Maria said urgently, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please hurry, I can feel it spreading." Clay's stomach twisted in shock. He had heard of people trying to suck out venom, but he had never seen it done. He wasn't a doctor, and the thought of doing something so intimate and desperate unsettled him. He knew it wasn't a guarantee that it would work. But Maria's life was in his hands, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his rough hands reaching for her leg. She winced as he gently touched the bite mark, feeling the heat radiating from the swelling. He could see the poison working its way through her veins, making her skin flush and her muscles stiff. Her body was already reacting to the venom, and if he didn't act quickly, it could be too late. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaky. He wasn't sure he could do it. Maria nodded, her face pale but determined. "Please, I don't have much time." Clay hesitated for just a moment longer, but when he saw how weak she was becoming, the decision was made. He knelt down beside her, his hands trembling. The desert air felt colder than it ever had before, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't how he had expected his evening to go. But in the desert, when life and death were always a breath away, there was no room for hesitation. He took a deep breath and did what he had to do. Clay's hands were rough and calloused from years of hard labor, yet they trembled as he pressed them against Maria's leg. The bite mark was deep, and the dark venom spread rapidly under her skin, causing it to swell and discolor. The fear in Maria's eyes told him everything he needed to know. He had no time to waste. As he knelt beside her, his mind raced. The stories he had heard about snake bites, the old remedies that people spoke of, and the few times he had seen a man survive one. It was all flooding his memory in a whirlwind of uncertainty. But there was no room for doubt now. Maria needed help, and the only thing he could offer was his best attempt at saving her. Maria was growing weaker by the minute. Her breath was coming faster, and her forehead glistened with sweat. Her usual strength, that quiet confidence she carried with her like a shield, was slipping away with each passing second. She had always been tough, surviving in the unforgiving desert with its scorching sun and cold nights. But rattlesnake venom was something no one could fight alone. It was a silent killer, quick and merciless. Clay looked up at her face again, trying to gauge her condition. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now clouded with pain. She was still standing, though barely, leaning heavily on the horse's saddle for support. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had to do this. He had to try, no matter how difficult it seemed. "Stay with me, Maria," he said, his voice rough. His words were meant to be reassuring, but he wasn't sure if she could even hear him properly anymore. Her gaze seemed distant, her focus drifting in and out. Maria's lips parted slightly, but the words that came from her mouth were barely audible. "You have to hurry, Clay." Her plea struck him like a physical blow. There was no time to waste. With a quick glance at the bite, Clay knew what he had to do. He had heard tales of people sucking venom from a snake bite, but it was a dangerous and uncertain method. It was no guarantee that it would work, and there were risks involved. But Maria's life was in danger, and there was no other option. He took a deep breath and positioned himself closer to her wound. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment he wondered if he was making the right choice. What if this didn't work? What if it made things worse? But Maria was still holding on, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. He placed his hands gently around her leg, feeling the heat radiate from the swollen flesh. The skin was already becoming discolored, a mixture of purple and dark red, and he could feel the poison spreading. He took another deep breath, trying to steady his hands, and leaned in closer. With one final glance at Maria's pained face, he did what he had to do. It was as if the world around him faded. The only thing that existed in that moment was the frantic beat of his heart, the rapid rise and fall of Maria's chest, and the steady pressure of his hands on her leg. His thoughts were scattered, but the one thing that was clear was that he needed to get the venom out. Time was against him. The venom was moving quickly, and if he didn't act fast, Maria wouldn't survive. The minutes stretched on endlessly. Clay worked as quickly as he could, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the rustle of the wind and the faint, shallow breaths of Maria. He could feel the poison moving through her leg, making it harder for her to breathe, making her muscles tense and stiff. It was as though her entire body was rebelling against the venom, but there was nothing she could do. Clay's hands were shaking more now, his body starting to feel the strain of the effort. He could taste the bitterness of the venom on his tongue, and his own stomach churned in response. He hadn't expected it to be like this, not this overwhelming, not this personal. But in that moment there was no room for anything but survival. There was no room for hesitation. Maria needed him, and he wasn't about to let her slip away. "Please, just hold on, Maria," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure she could even hear him anymore. The quiet desert night seemed to press in around them, making the situation feel even more intense. The moon, a thin crescent in the sky, hung low, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Clay was losing track of time, but he could feel that the venom was starting to slow its progression. He had to believe that the worst was over, that his actions had made a difference. Maria's breath was shallow, but she hadn't collapsed yet. She was still with him. That was something. Clay dared not look away from her, afraid that if he lost his focus for even a second, it could cost her life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled back slightly, his chest heaving with the effort. He could see the faint signs of improvement in Maria. The swelling was beginning to recede, and the dark redness around the bite mark wasn't spreading as quickly. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that something was working. Maria's eyes fluttered open and she looked up at Clay. Her lips parted and a soft, almost inaudible whisper escaped. "You did it." Clay let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were slick with sweat and the remnants of venom, but he didn't care. He had done it. He had saved her. The weight of the moment began to settle on him, and he realized just how much he had feared losing her. He had never thought about how much her presence meant to him until now. Out here in the desert, where everything was harsh and unforgiving, Maria had always been a constant. Her knowledge of the land, her wisdom, and her strength had always been a source of quiet comfort. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Maria's head lolled slightly to one side, her body still weak, but the signs of life were there. She was still breathing, still alive. Slowly, with a strength he didn't know she had left, she lifted her hand to touch his arm. "Thank you, Clay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved me." Clay gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't sure if he had saved her completely, not yet, but he had done everything he could. That was all that mattered. "Just rest now," he said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "You're going to be all right." Maria nodded faintly, closing her eyes. The fight had left her, but she was still alive, and that was enough for now. Clay sat beside her, his mind still racing. The night stretched on, the silence of the desert thick around them. The coyotes had stopped howling, and the wind had died down to a gentle breeze. It was as if the world itself had given them a brief respite, allowing them to catch their breath. For a moment, there was peace. A fleeting moment that allowed them both to rest in the quiet after the storm. Clay didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to believe that Maria would make it through. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The sky turned from dark to a pale blue, and the stars slowly faded away. Clay didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in the fire of survival, and there was no need for words now. They had shared something beyond explanation, a trust that had been built in the harshest of conditions. And for that, Clay was grateful. As the first light of dawn began to stretch across the desert sky, Clay sat by Maria, his mind still racing. The hours since the snakebite had blurred into a haze of concern and quick action. And now, with the worst seemingly behind them, a strange silence had settled between them. Maria's breath had steadied, the tightness in her chest easing, and though her body was still weak, there was hope in her eyes. She wasn't just alive, she was going to make it. But Clay couldn't shake the weight of the moment. He had never imagined that his quiet life on the ranch would lead to something like this. He had spent years isolated from the world, tending to cattle and doing what needed to be done. He had learned to rely on his instincts, to trust the rhythm of the land and the animals that roamed it. But Maria was different. She had become part of his world in a way he hadn't realized until now. The bond between them, which had always been rooted in mutual respect, had deepened in a way that he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just about saving her life. It was about something deeper, something that connected them in the most profound way possible. Maria stirred beside him, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment her gaze was unfocused, but as her eyes locked onto Clay's, a faint smile appeared on her lips. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She had come so close to losing everything, yet here she was, still fighting. "You're still here," Maria whispered, her voice soft and raspy, still recovering from the ordeal. Clay gave a small nod. "I'm not going anywhere." She let out a quiet laugh, though it was interrupted by a cough. She winced, her hand instinctively pressing against her side. Clay immediately reached out to steady her, concerned that she might be pushing herself too much. But Maria just shook her head gently, refusing to let her weakness show. "I've been through worse," she said, though her voice was laced with exhaustion. "But I'll admit, I didn't think I'd make it through this one." Clay's brow furrowed. "It's not over yet," he said quietly. "You need to rest. Don't push yourself too hard." Maria nodded but said nothing more. She closed her eyes again, the exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. The world seemed to slow around them. The desert was waking up, the birds beginning to sing in the distance, and the air, which had been so still during the night, was now beginning to stir with a gentle breeze. Clay leaned back against the weathered wooden post of the porch, his gaze never leaving Maria. He was still shaken by the urgency of the situation, the way she had begged him for help, the way her life had hung in the balance. He had always been a man of action, someone who faced challenges head-on, but this was different. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a test of everything he had ever known. He had never been asked to save a life in this way before, and it had left a mark on him. For a long time, there was only silence between them. Clay kept his watchful eye on the horizon, his mind replaying the events of the night. It was strange how quickly things could change. One moment, the world had seemed calm and predictable, and then Maria had shown up on horseback, injured and desperate. It had been a race against time, and in the end, he had done what needed to be done. But the weight of the responsibility still hung heavily on his shoulders. Maria's voice broke through his thoughts. "You did more than just save my life, Clay." He turned to look at her, meeting her tired but grateful gaze. "I just did what needed to be done." She smiled again, though it was faint. "It's more than that. You didn't hesitate, you didn't run, you stayed with me." Clay felt a lump form in his throat. The words she spoke, though simple, carried a depth that went beyond the immediate situation. She was right. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't run. But it was more than just the act of saving her life. It was about something deeper, something that connected them in that moment, something that was still unfolding between them. The air around them seemed to grow warmer as the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The desert was coming alive. Clay could hear the faint rustle of the wind against the dry earth, the distant calls of animals greeting the morning. It was a familiar sound, one he had heard countless times before, but today it felt different. The land around him seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting for something. Maria shifted slightly, her face pale but determined. She looked up at the sky as if drawing strength from the vast expanse above them. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I've been out here in this desert for most of my life. I've learned to survive alone, but sometimes even the strongest among us need someone." Clay didn't know how to respond. His throat tightened as he looked at her, at this woman who had lived a life so different from his own yet was still so much like him. She was strong, fierce, and self-reliant, but she was also human. And in that moment, he realized that they weren't so different after all. They both had their weaknesses, their fears, and their vulnerabilities. "You don't have to be alone out here, Marya," he said quietly, the words coming from a place deep inside him. He wasn't sure where they came from, but they felt right. "I'm here. I've always been here." Marya turned her head slightly, her eyes searching his. For a moment, it seemed as though she was weighing his words, considering them in a way that only someone who had lived a life as hard as hers could. Then she gave a small nod, her gaze softening. "I know," she said, "and that means more to me than you'll ever understand." Clay felt a warmth spread through him at her words. It was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had formed in the midst of chaos in the face of danger. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. It was about realizing that even in the harshest of circumstances, people could rely on one another. The morning passed slowly. Marya remained resting, though her strength was slowly returning. She drank some water, ate a small portion of food that Clay had prepared earlier, and allowed herself to close her eyes again. Clay kept a close watch on her, making sure she didn't try to overexert herself. As the hours wore on, Clay couldn't help but think about what had happened. The way he had acted without thinking, without hesitation, had surprised even him. In the past, he had always been a man of routine, someone who followed the expected course of action. But when it came to Marya, everything had changed. He hadn't thought about the risks or the consequences. He had just done what needed to be done. And now, as he sat beside her, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, he realized that something had shifted within him. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He wasn't just a man who lived alone in the desert. He was part of something bigger now, part of a connection that stretched beyond survival. For the first time in years, Clay allowed himself to think about what could come next. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He had faced death alongside Marya, and they had survived. Together. The day wore on, and the desert, once again, began to reveal its harsh beauty. Clay kept a close watch over Marya, though she was growing stronger with each passing hour. The poison that had so nearly claimed her life had been pushed back, and now, the heat of the day seemed to hold a gentle promise of recovery. The swelling in her leg had gone down significantly, and the discoloration, once dark and menacing, had started to fade. But Clay wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. He stayed vigilant, waiting for any signs that might suggest a setback. Marya rested, her head leaning against the wooden porch post. The steady rhythm of her breathing told him that she was no longer struggling for air, no longer fighting the effects of the venom. Still, there was a quiet tension in the air, a reminder that they weren't out of the woods yet. She was still too weak to stand on her own, and the sun was unforgiving, scorching everything in its path. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, the desert began to feel alive with a different kind of energy. The heat buzzed in the air, and the land seemed to pulse with life in every direction. Even though Clay and Marya were sitting in the quiet of the ranch, the world around them was moving at its own pace. The wind began to pick up, the dry earth stirring and sending small clouds of dust into the air. The coyotes, who had been silent through the night, were now active, their calls echoing across the plains. For the first time since the incident, Clay felt the weight of everything that had happened. His hands still tingled from where he had touched Marya's leg, still stained with the remnants of the venom. His mind replayed the events over and over, the way Marya had arrived, broken and desperate, the urgency in her eyes, the way her body had fought against the poison. He had never been this close to death before, never had his own actions been so critical to someone else's survival. And in that moment, he realized just how much his life had changed. The ranch had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the world. Out here, he had no expectations to meet, no obligations to fulfill other than the ones he set for himself. But with Marya's survival, things had shifted. The connection between them was undeniable now. What had started as a simple neighborly relationship had become something more, something neither of them had expected. As the sun continued to climb higher, Clay decided it was time to check on the rest of the ranch. There were still animals to care for, chores to be done, but he found it difficult to pull himself away from Maria's side. She had made it through the worst, but he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. Her body needed rest, and the wound still had to be monitored closely. Clay turned to Maria, who had been watching him quietly. Her eyes, though still faintly clouded from the poison, held a strength he hadn't seen in her before. She was always strong, but this was different. She was still alive, still fighting, and he could see that the will to live was as strong in her as the land itself. "Do you need anything?" Clay asked, his voice low but steady. His hands, though worn and tired, were always ready to offer help. He had learned long ago that being a rancher meant constantly giving, constantly providing, and he had done so without question. But now, with Maria, it felt different. He wanted to do more. He needed to do more. Maria shook her head, her lips curving into a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "Just don't leave me alone, okay?" Clay nodded, his heart tightening at her words. It wasn't just the poison that had almost taken her life, it was the isolation. The desert was a harsh place to live, and even though Maria had survived in it for years, there were times when everyone needed someone. Maybe, just maybe, she needed him more than she was willing to admit. "I'm not going anywhere," Clay said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. He meant it. He left her side only long enough to tend to the animals and ensure the ranch was running smoothly. He was efficient as always, moving between the barn and the fields with quick, purposeful strides. But his mind never strayed far from Maria. He could feel the pull, the concern gnawing at him. Every few minutes, he would glance back at the house, just to make sure she was still okay. It was as though the land itself had taken on a different meaning for him. The ranch, which had once been nothing more than a patch of earth to work, now seemed to hold a deeper significance. It was the place where he had lived for years, isolated but content, and it was the place where Maria had come close to losing her life. When he finally returned to the house, he found Maria sitting up, leaning against the porch post with her eyes closed. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still appeared tired, she seemed stronger. It was a slow recovery, but it was progress. He could see the small signs, the way her shoulders no longer sagged, the way she was able to move her leg without grimacing in pain. "Feeling better?" Clay asked, his voice soft but steady. He stood a few steps away, watching her closely. He didn't want to crowd her, but he couldn't help but want to make sure she was truly all right. Maria nodded, opening her eyes to meet his. There was something in her gaze that made him stop, something deeper than gratitude, something he wasn't sure how to name. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you," she said, her voice almost lost in the breeze. "I thought I was done for, but you didn't give up on me." Clay shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. He didn't know what to say to that. He had never done anything out of the ordinary. He had just done what any person would do for someone they cared about. But the way Maria was looking at him now was different. It was a look of respect, yes, but there was something else there too, a quiet understanding. "You don't need to thank me," Clay said, his words coming out more gruff than he intended. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because you needed help." Maria smiled faintly, though her eyes never left his. "You're not just a rancher, Clay," she said softly. "You're something more." Her words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Clay wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent his entire life believing that he was just a simple man, working the land, living in isolation. But the connection between them had changed everything. He wasn't just a rancher anymore, not to her, not to himself either. There was something about this desert that brought clarity, something about surviving together in the harshest of conditions that made the world feel more real, more alive. And in that moment, Clay realized that he wasn't just surviving out here. He was living. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a golden light over the land, Clay and Maria sat together on the porch. There were no words between them now, just a quiet understanding. Maria's recovery was far from over, but she had come so far, and Clay was determined to stay by her side. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about the next chore or the next task. He was thinking about the present. About the bond that had formed between them in the middle of the desert, about the life they had created in the quiet of this place. The world outside was still, and for once, it felt as though everything was right. The desert had tested them both, but it had also brought them closer than either of them could have imagined. As the sun set behind the jagged mountains in the distance, the desert began to cool. The heat of the day gave way to the crisp, still air of the evening. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the land seemed to glow under the soft light. Maria and Clay sat in silence on the porch, each lost in their own thoughts, but both aware of the quiet bond that had grown between them. The world around them was settling into its evening rhythm, distant howls of coyotes, the chirp of crickets, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry grass. It was peaceful, and yet there was something different in the air, a sense of change. Maria had recovered more than Clay had expected. Her strength was returning steadily, and her color had improved from the pale, sickly hue that had once covered her face. She could sit up without grimacing in pain, and though her legs still bore the marks of the snakebite, it was no longer swollen. The fever that had taken over her body was gone, replaced with the quiet confidence that she was accustomed to. For Clay, the days had felt long, stretching with moments of tension and relief. At times, he had been consumed with worry, watching for signs that the poison might make a comeback, but Maria had pulled through. She was a fighter, strong in ways that Clay had never fully understood until now. Though Maria wasn't fully healed, she was well enough to help with small tasks around the ranch. Her movements were still slow and cautious, but she was determined to contribute in whatever way she could. As the days passed, the once deserted ranch began to feel more like a home. They worked together, feeding the animals, tending to the land, and even making small repairs to the weathered fence that surrounded the property. It wasn't much, but it felt like enough. The bond that had formed between them wasn't just born out of necessity or survival. It was something deeper, something that had grown in the space between actions and words. It was trust, it was respect, and maybe in some small way it was even more than that. Clay had always been a solitary man. He had kept to himself, working the land, focusing on the tasks that needed to be done, and shutting out everything else. But in the days following Maria's bite, something had shifted in him. He no longer found comfort in his isolation. He no longer wanted to live without connection. Maria had shown him the value of being there for someone, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, everyday moments that made up life. The work, the small conversations, the shared understanding of what it meant to survive in a place like this. But it wasn't just Maria's survival that had changed him. It was also her resilience, her ability to bounce back from what could have been a fatal injury, and her refusal to be defeated by anything, least of all the unforgiving land. Clay had always admired her for her strength, but now he admired her in a way that went beyond respect. He realized how much he had come to depend on her presence, how much he had come to care for her. One evening, as they worked together in the barn, Maria paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow. She had been moving bales of hay from one side of the barn to the other, but the weight of the task had been slowing her down. "I'm almost done," she said, giving Clay a tired but determined smile. "Just a few more, and then I can help you with the cattle." Clay stepped over to her, his hands still covered in dust from the work. "You've done enough for today," he said, his voice soft. "You should rest. Don't push yourself too hard." Maria shook her head, brushing off his concern. I can handle it, she said, though the fatigue in her voice was evident. Besides, I want to help. I don't like being in your debt. Clay studied her for a moment. He had heard those words before, but they hit differently now. Maria had always been independent, never one to rely on anyone else for help. She had done things on her own for so long that the idea of accepting help, of depending on someone, seemed difficult for her. But Clay understood now. She wasn't just refusing help out of pride. She had learned to survive alone, and that was a hard habit to break. You're not in my debt, he said, his voice steady but gentle. You don't owe me anything. Maria's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. She didn't say anything more, but the look she gave him spoke volumes. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of uncertainty, but it was a rhythm nonetheless. Clay took on the heavier tasks, the ones that required more strength, while Maria handled the smaller, more delicate chores. Together, they made the ranch feel alive again. There were evenings when they would sit on the porch together, watching the stars as they slowly filled the sky. It was a quiet time, a time for reflection, and for being present with one another. They didn't speak much during these moments, but the silence was comfortable. It was as if the land had become a bridge between them, bringing them closer together without the need for words. The quiet desert nights seemed to hold them in a way that nothing else could. One evening, as they watched the sky change from purple to black, Maria spoke, her voice low but steady. "Do you ever wonder what the future holds, Clay?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the stars. Clay took a slow breath, considering her question. The future had always been something that seemed so far away, something he had never allowed himself to think about too much. The ranch, the cattle, the land, that was his world. But in that moment, as he looked at Maria, he realized that the future wasn't as distant as he had once thought. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I used to think the future didn't matter, but I think maybe it does." Maria turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a wave of warmth through him. "I used to think the same thing," she said, her voice softer now. "But sometimes we need to have a future to look forward to. We need to believe there's something more than just survival." Clay didn't answer right away. Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The future wasn't something he had ever considered. But now, with Maria beside him, it was hard not to imagine a life beyond the ranch. A life that was more than just the land and the cattle, a life that was about connection and belonging. "Maybe we do," he said finally, his voice low but certain. "Maybe there's more to look forward to than I thought." They sat in silence after that, but the weight of the moment wasn't uncomfortable. It was the beginning of something. What it was, neither of them knew yet, but it was there, quietly growing between them like the desert itself, strong and enduring. As the days passed, the ranch continued to thrive. Maria's strength returned fully, and with it came a sense of purpose. They worked side by side, facing whatever challenges came their way, always with the unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone. They had each other now, in a way that went beyond friendship, beyond simple survival. They had built something new, something stronger than either of them could have imagined. One day, as the sky above them stretched out in a brilliant blue, Maria stopped Clay as they were finishing up with the animals. "You know," she said, her voice light but full of meaning, "I think we've both come a long way." Clay turned to her, his hands resting on the fence post. "We have," he agreed, "and it's only just the beginning." Maria smiled, and in that moment everything felt right. The desert, the ranch, the land, they were all part of their journey now. And as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever the future held, together.